My boyfriend's father called me street garbage at a family dinner, not behind my back, not in a moment of anger. During dessert, in front of 20 people, he looked at me and said, "My son could have chosen from so many accomplished women, but instead he brought home street garbage." The table went silent. My boyfriend froze. His mother looked at her plate, and I sat there, a 26-year-old woman who'd grown up in foster care, worked 2 jobs to put herself through community college, and built a successful career as a paralegal, being told I wasn't good enough because I didn't come from money. What his father didn't know was that I'd spent the past 3 months working late nights, preparing something completely unrelated to his son. His company had hired the law firm where I worked to handle a complicated merger. I'd been the paralegal on the case, and I'd found something in the documents, something his lawyers had missed, something that could cost him everything. I didn't plan revenge, but when someone calls you garbage, sometimes the trash takes itself out in the most expensive way possible. The first time I met Richard Whitmore, he looked at me like I was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. It was 18 months ago, a Sunday brunch at the Whitmore family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Chris had been nervous for weeks leading up to it, coaching me on which fork to use, which topics to avoid, how to address his parents. "My father can be intense," Chris had said, which I would later learn was like saying the ocean can be damp. "He has very specific ideas about success and achievement. Just be yourself, but maybe, emphasize the paralegal career and downplay the foster care background." I should have known then that any relationship requiring me to hide fundamental parts of my identity was doomed. But I was in love with Chris, who was kind and genuine and nothing like his father, and I thought I could handle one difficult parent. I'd survived worse. I grew up in the foster care system in Massachusetts. My mother died of an overdose when I was 6, no father on the birth certificate, no relatives who wanted a traumatized kid. I bounced between 7 different homes before aging out at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a determination to never be powerless again. I worked full-time at a grocery store while attending community college at night, taking out loans I'm still paying off, studying until 2 a.m. in the break room between shifts. I transferred to UMass Boston, finished my bachelor's in 3 years, and got hired as a paralegal at Morrison & Holt, one of Boston's most prestigious corporate law firms. At 26, I was making $68,000 a year, had my own apartment in Somerville, and was damn proud of what I'd built from nothing. But to Richard Whitmore, none of that mattered, because I hadn't gone to Harvard, because my last name was Rodriguez, not Rockefeller, because, when he asked about my family background at that first brunch, I'd been honest enough to mention foster care, and I'd watched his expression shift from polite interest to barely concealed disdain in real time. "Foster care," he'd repeated, setting down his coffee cup with a decisive clink. "How unfortunate, though I suppose it builds character." His tone suggested it built the wrong kind of character. Chris's mother, Patricia, had tried to smooth things over, asking about my work, but Richard had already made his assessment. For the next 18 months, every interaction with him was colored by that initial judgment. He never asked about my job, never acknowledged my achievements. At family gatherings, he'd introduce Chris's siblings' partners with glowing descriptions of their pedigrees and connections, then get to me with, "And this is Maya, she works in a law firm," making my career sound like I was a receptionist rather than a paralegal who'd just been promoted to senior associate paralegal with a specialty in corporate mergers. Chris noticed. He'd apologize after every family event, promise to talk to his father, insist that Richard would come around eventually. But he never confronted him directly, never demanded that his father treat me with basic respect, and I, stupidly, kept accepting the apologies and showing up to family dinners, hoping that if I was just accomplished enough, just professional enough, just perfect enough, Richard might finally see my worth. Then came the merger. What I discovered in the documents for Richard Whitmore's business deal would give me leverage I never wanted, but after being called street garbage in front of his entire family, I would use every bit of it to teach him that competence matters more than pedigree. 3 months before the dinner that changed everything, Morrison and Holt was retained by Whitmore Industries to handle the legal aspects of a major merger. Richard's manufacturing company was being acquired by a larger West Coast firm for $87 million. It was the kind of deal Richard had been working toward for years, his big exit, the culmination of a career spent building a mid-sized company into something acquisition-worthy. The partner on the case was James Morrison himself, one of the firm's founders. I was assigned as the lead paralegal, responsible for reviewing due diligence documents, organizing the massive paper trail of contracts and agreements, and flagging any potential issues for the attorneys to address. I had no idea Richard Whitmore was Chris's father until 2 weeks into the project when I saw his name on a signature page. I'd never connected the dots because Chris didn't work in his father's business and rarely talked about the specifics of what his father did. When I realized, my stomach dropped. I went to Morrison immediately. I need to disclose a potential conflict. Richard Whitmore is my boyfriend's father. I can recuse myself from the case if needed. Morrison had considered it, then shook his head. You're not related by marriage, you're not benefiting financially from the deal, and frankly, you're the best paralegal we have for this type of work. Can you remain professional and objective? Absolutely, I said, and I meant it. Whatever my personal feelings about Richard, I took my work seriously. This was an $87 million transaction involving dozens of employees whose livelihoods depended on it going smoothly. My job was to make sure every document was in order, every regulation was met, every potential liability was identified and addressed. I worked on that merger for 3 months. Late nights, weekends, thousands of pages of contracts, and financial statements and regulatory filings. I found and flagged dozens of minor issues, things the lawyers corrected before they became problems. I was thorough, meticulous, and completely professional. And then, 6 days before the dinner, I found it. It was buried in the environmental compliance section, a subsection of a subsection that most people would have skimmed. Whitmore Industries had acquired a smaller manufacturing facility in Pennsylvania 15 years ago. As part of that acquisition, they'd assumed responsibility for environmental remediation of contaminated soil on the property. The remediation was supposed to be completed within 5 years per the purchase agreement and EPA regulations. It hadn't been completed, not even started according to the documentation I could find. The contamination was still there, still Whitmore Industries' legal responsibility, and still a massive liability that hadn't been disclosed to the acquiring company. The potential cost of remediation, according to the environmental reports I dug up, was estimated at between $12 and $20 million. The merger agreement included standard representations and warranties about environmental compliance. If the acquiring company discovered this undisclosed liability after closing, they could potentially void the entire deal or sue for damages. I flagged it immediately, wrote a detailed memo to Morrison explaining the issue, and attached all the supporting documentation. This was my job. This was what I was paid to do. The lawyers would address it with Richard's team, the acquiring company would be notified, and the deal would either be renegotiated to account for the liability or potentially collapse altogether. It wasn't personal. It was professional due diligence that I was ethically and legally obligated to perform. I sent the memo on a Tuesday afternoon. Morrison called me into his office an hour later. This is excellent work, Maya. Extremely thorough. This could have been a disaster if it had been discovered after closing. I'm contacting Whitmore's counsel now to address this immediately. Will it kill the deal? I asked. Possibly. Or they'll renegotiate. Either way, you potentially saved this firm from a malpractice claim and saved our client from a major financial disaster. Well done. I went home that night feeling proud of my work and completely unaware that I'd just set in motion a series of events that would explode 4 days later at a family dinner. What I didn't know was that Richard Whitmore's lawyers had been hiding that environmental issue deliberately, gambling that no one would find it, and my discovery had just cost him the retirement payout he'd been counting on. The dinner was on Saturday night, a celebration of Richard and Patricia's 35th wedding anniversary. The entire extended family was invited: Chris's 2 siblings and their spouses, Patricia's sister and her family, several of Richard's business associates and their wives, 23 people total, seated at a long table in the Whitmore's formal dining room that probably cost more than I made in 2 years. I'd worn my best dress, a navy blue sheath that Chris had assured me was appropriately formal. I'd practiced small talk topics with Chris on the drive up. I'd been determined to be the perfect guest, to finally win Richard over, to prove I belonged in this world of old money and country clubs. The dinner started pleasantly enough. Patricia was gracious, asking about my work in only the vaguest terms, careful not to mention anything specific about Morrison and Holt or the merger I'd been working on. Chris's siblings were friendly, their spouses polite. The food was exceptional, catered by someone whose name I was supposed to recognize but didn't. Richard mostly ignored me, which was actually better than his usual condescension. He held court at the head of the table, telling stories about business victories and golf games, accepting congratulations on his 35 years of marriage and his upcoming retirement. He seemed to be in an unusually good mood, drinking more wine than I'd ever seen him consume. I should have recognized it as the dangerous kind of good mood, the kind fueled by alcohol and ego and a need to prove dominance. Dessert was served, some elaborate chocolate thing that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. People were laughing, toasting, sharing memories. I was starting to relax, thinking maybe this dinner would pass without incident. Then Richard stood up, wineglass in hand, and everything changed. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began, and people settled in for what was clearly going to be a speech. 35 years ago, Patricia and I started this journey together. We built a life, a family, a legacy. We taught our children the importance of choosing partners wisely, of understanding that who you marry determines not just your happiness, but your place in society. I felt Chris tense beside me. He knew where this was going before I did. "Christopher, Elaine, and Michael, you've all found partners who understand what it means to be part of a family like ours. Well, most of you have." The table went quiet. Patricia put her hand on Richard's arm, a warning gesture, but he shook it off. "Christopher, I've tried to be patient. I've tried to understand this relationship of yours, but I can't pretend anymore." He looked directly at me, his eyes slightly unfocused from the wine, but his intention crystal clear. My son could have chosen from so many accomplished women. Women from good families, with proper backgrounds, with the education and breeding that would complement his position in life. Instead, he brought home street garbage. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Someone gasped. I heard Patricia say, "Richard," in a horrified whisper. Chris half stood from his chair, then seemed to freeze, unable to move or speak. I sat perfectly still, my hands in my lap, my face carefully neutral, while something cold and final settled in my chest. Not shock, I realized, not even hurt, just a crystalline clarity about exactly who these people were and exactly what I needed to do. Richard wasn't finished. "I'm sorry to be blunt, but someone needs to say it. Foster care, working class background, community college, that's not who we are. That's not who Christopher should be associating with, let alone bringing to family events. It's embarrassing." "Father, that's enough." Chris finally found his voice, but it was weak, ineffective. "No, it's not enough. Someone needs to protect this family's reputation. Someone needs to remind you that decisions have consequences, that marrying beneath your station affects not just you, but all of us." I stood up. Calmly, deliberately, I placed my napkin on the table, pushed in my chair, and looked directly at Richard Whitmore. "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Whitmore. It was lovely. I'll be leaving now." "Maya, please." Patricia started, but I was already walking toward the door. Chris caught up with me in the foyer. "Maya, I'm so sorry. He's drunk. He meant every word." I picked up my purse from the entry table. "And you let him say it. You sat there and let your father call me garbage in front of your entire family, and you didn't do anything until it was too late to matter." "I'll talk to him. I'll make him apologize. Don't bother. I don't need his apology." I looked at Chris, this man I'd thought I might marry, and saw him clearly for the first time. Not cruel like his father, but weak in a way that was almost worse. "I need you to drive me to the train station now." He did, in silence, both of us understanding that something fundamental had broken. At the station, I got out of his car without kissing him goodbye. "I'll call you tomorrow," Chris said. "We'll figure this out." "There's nothing to figure out," I said, and walked into the station without looking back. But what neither Chris nor his father knew was that while they'd been humiliating me over dessert, the consequences of my professional work were already in motion, and by Monday morning, Richard Whitmore's entire retirement plan would be in ruins because of the street garbage paralegal he'd so publicly dismissed. I spent Sunday in my apartment, ignoring calls from Chris, texts from Patricia apologizing on Richard's behalf, and a voicemail from Chris's sister expressing her horror at her father's behavior. I didn't want apologies from people who'd sat at that table and said nothing while I was being degraded. I didn't want explanations or excuses. I wanted to forget the whole thing and move on with my life. But I couldn't because Monday morning I had to go to work, and at work, the Whitmore Industries merger was falling apart in spectacular fashion. Morrison called an emergency meeting at 8 a.m. The entire deal team was there. 3 partners, 2 associates, and me, the senior paralegal who'd found the environmental compliance issue. The acquiring company received our disclosure about the Pennsylvania property contamination on Friday, Morrison began. As of Saturday evening, they've put the entire transaction on hold pending further environmental assessment. Preliminary estimates suggest the remediation costs could be as high as $25 million, significantly higher than initial projections. One of the associates whistled low. "That's nearly 30% of the deal value." "Exactly. Whitmore's counsel is arguing that the environmental issue was disclosed in prior documentation and therefore isn't grounds for renegotiation. We're currently reviewing every document in the data room to verify their claim. Maya, you're the most familiar with the file. Did you see any prior disclosure of this specific contamination issue?" I shook my head. "No. I reviewed every environmental report in the data room. The Pennsylvania property was mentioned, but the ongoing contamination and remediation liability was not disclosed. The only way I found it was by cross-referencing the acquisition documents from 15 years ago with current EPA records. Which means Whitmore's team either missed it or deliberately concealed it." Morrison's expression was grim. "Either way, this is likely to kill the deal or require a significant price reduction. I need everyone on this today. Go through every single document again. If there's any evidence that Whitmore Industries knew about this issue and failed to disclose it, we need to find it." I spent Monday doing exactly that, reviewing thousands of pages of documents, looking for any evidence that Richard or his team had known about the contamination, and I found it. Email exchanges from 3 years ago discussing the Pennsylvania property. A consulting report recommending immediate remediation to avoid regulatory penalties. Internal memos acknowledging the liability, but deciding to defer the work to after the sale when it would be someone else's problem. Richard Whitmore had known. He'd known for years, and he'd deliberately chosen not to disclose it, gambling that his lawyers and the acquiring company's due diligence team wouldn't find it. But I had found it. The street garbage paralegal with the foster care background and the community college degree had found what his expensive lawyers had missed or helped him hide. I compiled all the evidence into a comprehensive memo and delivered it to Morrison at 4 p.m. on Monday. He read it in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is fraud," he said finally, "or close enough that it doesn't matter. The acquiring company is going to walk, and they might sue. Whitmore is facing regulatory penalties from the EPA, and this firm could potentially be accused of participating in the concealment if we'd missed this and let the deal close." "We didn't miss it," I said quietly. "We did our job." "You did your job, Maya, exceptionally. If you hadn't caught this, if you hadn't been as thorough as you were, this firm would be facing a malpractice claim that could have cost us millions. Instead, you saved us and potentially saved the acquiring company from a $25 million liability they didn't know they were assuming." He looked at me with something like curiosity. "Richard Whitmore is your boyfriend's father, correct?" "Ex-boyfriend," I said, "as of Saturday night." "I see. Does the timing of the breakup have anything to do with this case?" "The breakup has everything to do with being called street garbage in front of 20 people at a family dinner. The case has everything to do with doing my job thoroughly and professionally. The two things are not related, except in the sense that Richard Whitmore severely underestimated someone he considered beneath him." Morrison smiled, a rare expression. "Never underestimate a paralegal, especially one who actually reads the documents. Good work, Maya. Take Tuesday as a comp day. You've earned it." I went home Monday night and finally listened to the voicemails Chris had left. 5 messages, each more desperate than the last. The final one, left at 6 p.m. Monday, was different. "Maya, I need to talk to you. Something's happened with my father's business deal. The merger is falling apart. He's saying it's because of something your law firm found. He's saying you did this deliberately to hurt him. Please call me. Please tell me that's not true." What Chris didn't understand, what Richard would never understand, was that I'd done exactly what I was supposed to do, my job, with excellence and integrity, and if that excellence destroyed Richard's fraudulent business deal, that wasn't revenge, that was consequences. I called Chris back Tuesday morning. He answered on the first ring. "Did you know?" he asked without preamble. "When you were at dinner Saturday night, did you already know you'd found something that would kill his deal?" "I'd flagged a compliance issue on Tuesday. I sent a memo to my supervising partner. That's my job, Chris. That's what paralegals do on merger transactions. We review documents and flag problems." "But you knew it was his deal. You knew it would hurt him." "I knew it was a major legal liability that could have resulted in a massive lawsuit against the acquiring company and a malpractice claim against my firm if we'd missed it. So yes, I knew it would affect the deal. That's the entire point of due diligence." "The timing, Maya. You found this right before the dinner where he said those things. And now the deal is dead, and he's losing everything. You have to see how this looks." I felt something cold settle into place, a final understanding of who Chris really was. "How it looks. Chris, I found evidence that your father has been deliberately concealing a $25 million environmental liability. That's fraud. I did exactly what I'm ethically and legally obligated to do. The timing is unfortunate, but the professional responsibility doesn't change because someone insulted me. He's devastated. This was supposed to be his retirement. He was counting on this money. Then he shouldn't have committed fraud by hiding a massive environmental liability. Chris, I didn't create this problem. Your father did, years ago, when he decided to ignore contamination and hope no one would notice. I just did my job competently enough to find what his expensive lawyers missed." "You did this to punish him," Chris said, and his voice was so certain, so convinced of my guilt, that I almost laughed. "I did this because I'm good at my job. I'm sorry that hurts your father's feelings, but my professional obligations don't disappear because he called me street garbage. If anything, he should probably stop insulting people who might be in a position to notice his fraudulent business practices." "So you admit it. You're using your job to get revenge." I admit that I'm a thorough paralegal who reads documents carefully and flags compliance issues as required by my professional duties. If your father experiences consequences from that, perhaps he should have been more careful about whose competence he questioned while committing securities fraud. I hung up before he could respond. Chris called back immediately. I didn't answer. He called 17 more times over the next 3 days. I blocked his number. The merger officially collapsed on Thursday. The acquiring company walked away entirely, citing material misrepresentation in the disclosures. The EPA opened an investigation into the Pennsylvania property contamination. Richard was facing regulatory penalties, potential criminal charges, and a company that was now effectively unsellable because any future buyer would know about the environmental liability. His retirement payout, the $87 million he'd been counting on, evaporated. His company's value dropped by more than 60% once the full scope of the environmental issues became public. The employees he'd claimed to care about faced an uncertain future as Richard scrambled to find funding to cover the remediation costs. And through it all, I went to work, did my job, and moved on with my life, because that's what street garbage does. We survive, we work hard, and when wealthy men who've committed fraud underestimate us, we don't even have to seek revenge. We just have to be competent. 2 weeks after the merger collapsed, I received an unexpected visitor at Morrison & Holt. The receptionist called my extension at 9:15 on a Monday morning. Maya, there's a Patricia Whitmore here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent and personal. I considered refusing. I'd moved on from the Whitmores, from Chris, from the entire toxic situation. But curiosity got the better of me. Patricia had been the only one at that dinner who'd seemed genuinely horrified by Richard's words, even if she hadn't done anything to stop them. Send her to conference room C. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Patricia looked smaller than I remembered, less polished. Her expensive clothing was still impeccable, but there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. She stood when I entered the conference room, her hands twisting together nervously. Maya, thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would. I have 15 minutes before a meeting. What can I do for you, Mrs. Whitmore? Please sit. I need to apologize for Richard's behavior at the dinner, for the things he said to you, for not stopping him sooner or more forcefully. I remained standing. Your husband called me street garbage in front of your entire family. An apology 2 weeks later doesn't really address that, does it? No, it doesn't. Nothing can address it, really. But I want you to know that I was horrified. I've told Richard that what he did was unforgivable. We've been sleeping in separate rooms since that night. That surprised me enough that I did sit down. Mrs. Whitmore, your marriage problems aren't my concern. I know, but I wanted you to understand that there are consequences happening, even if you don't see them. Richard is facing the collapse of everything he's built, not just professionally, but personally. Our marriage is in crisis. Christopher won't speak to his father. Elaine and Michael are both angry with him. The family is fractured. Because of what I found in the merger documents? Patricia looked at me directly for the first time. Because of what Richard did. The environmental fraud, the concealment, all of it. You didn't create those problems, Maya. You just revealed them. And I'm grateful for that, even if Richard isn't. Why are you here, Mrs. Whitmore? If it's just to apologize, consider it accepted. If it's to ask me to somehow help fix your husband's business problems, that's not going to happen. I'm here because I want you to understand something that Richard refuses to accept. You were exactly the kind of accomplished woman we should have been honored to welcome into our family. Foster care background, worked your way through school, built a successful career through pure determination and intelligence. That's not street garbage. That's American success story. That's what this country is supposed to celebrate. Her voice cracked slightly. I grew up with money, Maya. Boarding schools, debutante balls, all of it. And you know what I learned? Money doesn't make you better than anyone else. It just makes you more comfortable while you're being mediocre. Richard forgot that somewhere along the way. He started believing that wealth equaled worth, that pedigree equaled competence, and that arrogance is costing him everything. "What do you want from me?" I asked again. "Nothing. I just wanted you to know that some of us saw your value, even if we didn't say so loudly enough when it mattered. And I wanted to tell you that Christopher is devastated, not just about the business, though that's part of it, about losing you, about failing to defend you when his father attacked you. He knows he made a terrible mistake." What Patricia didn't know was that Chris had already tried to apologize dozens of times, and what she was about to tell me about his current state would test whether I had any sympathy left for the man who'd let me be humiliated without defending me. "Chris has been trying to reach me," I said. "I blocked his number." Patricia nodded. "He's not handling any of this well. The guilt about not defending you, the anger at his father, the stress of watching his family implode. He's barely functioning. He took a leave of absence from work. He's staying with Elaine because he can't be in the house with Richard. I'm sorry he's struggling, but that's not my problem to fix." "I know. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to consider that not everyone at that table wanted to hurt you. Some of us were shocked and ashamed and didn't react quickly enough. That doesn't excuse it, but it's the truth." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. Richard is threatening to sue your firm. Claims that you had a conflict of interest, that you deliberately sabotaged his deal because of personal animosity. His lawyers are telling him he doesn't have a case, but he's not listening. I thought you should know." After she left, I went directly to Morrison's office and relayed the conversation. He listened carefully, made notes, and then smiled grimly. "Let him sue. Our work on that transaction was impeccable, and you disclosed the relationship at the beginning. We have documentation of everything. If Richard Whitmore wants to add a frivolous lawsuit to his problems, that's his choice. But he won't win, and it'll cost him even more money he doesn't have. Will it affect my job here? Maya, your job is safer than it's ever been. You just saved this firm from a potential malpractice disaster." The partners met last week and voted unanimously to give you a bonus and a promotion to paralegal supervisor. "We're also raising your salary to $85,000. You're exactly the kind of professional we want to retain." I walked out of his office in a daze. A promotion, a $17,000 raise, recognition for competence rather than pedigree. Everything Richard Whitmore had said I'd never achieve because of my background. The irony wasn't lost on me. Over the next month, I watched from a distance as the Whitmore family situation continued to deteriorate, not because I was seeking updates, but because it became local business news. The EPA penalties were substantial, over $2 million. The contamination remediation would cost another $15 to $20 million. Richard was forced to take out massive loans using his personal assets as collateral just to keep Whitmore Industries afloat. The company that had been valued at $87 million before the merger announcement was now effectively worthless. No buyer would touch it with the environmental liabilities. Richard's retirement plan had gone from wealthy CEO selling successful business to struggling to avoid bankruptcy while facing regulatory penalties. And through various contacts, I heard other details. Chris and Richard weren't speaking. Patricia was seriously considering divorce. The country club membership had been quietly dropped due to financial pressure. Richard's golf buddies were avoiding him. The man who'd called me street garbage was learning what it felt like to be dismissed by the people he'd thought were his equals. I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Mostly I felt tired, but what I didn't expect was that Richard Whitmore would show up at my apartment 6 weeks after the dinner, and what he said would force me to decide whether revenge was enough or if something else mattered more. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. I'd just gotten home from work, still in my business attire, when my building's intercom buzzed. "Ms. Rodriguez, there's a Richard Whitmore here to see you." My first instinct was to refuse. But curiosity, that same trait that made me a good paralegal, won out again. Send him up. I opened my apartment door but stood in the doorway blocking entry. Richard looked worse than his wife had. His expensive suit hung looser on his frame, suggesting weight loss. His face was haggard, aged years in just 6 weeks. Mr. Whitmore, this is unexpected. May I come in? I won't take much of your time. I considered refusing, making him say whatever he came to say in the hallway where my neighbors might hear. But ultimately, I stepped aside and let him into my modest apartment that probably cost less per month than his monthly country club dues used to be. He looked around, and I saw him taking in the space. Small, but clean. IKEA furniture, student loan payment reminders on my refrigerator. The life of someone who'd worked for everything she had and was proud of it. Nice place, he said, and it didn't sound condescending. It sounded genuine. Thank you. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Whitmore. What do you want? He sat down uninvited on my couch, suddenly looking exhausted. I came to apologize for what I said at the dinner, for how I've treated you since you started dating Christopher, for not seeing what was obvious to everyone else. Which was that you're exceptional, that you'd worked harder and achieved more with no advantages than most people achieve with every advantage, that my son was lucky to have you, and I was too arrogant to recognize it. I remained standing, arms crossed. Why now? Because your business collapsed? Because you're facing bankruptcy? Or because you genuinely realized you were wrong? All of it, he admitted. I won't lie to you. The consequences have been devastating. I'm losing everything I spent 40 years building. My marriage is in crisis. My children won't speak to me. My reputation is destroyed. And yes, that's made me reassess a lot of assumptions I had about what matters. You committed fraud, Mr. Whitmore. You deliberately concealed environmental liabilities. That's not my fault. That's not because I found it. That's because you did it. I know. He looked at me directly. I made bad decisions years ago, thinking I could hide problems until they became someone else's responsibility. Then when your firm was hired for the merger, I convinced myself that my lawyers were good enough that no one would find what I'd hidden. I underestimated the due diligence process, and I especially underestimated you. Because I'm street garbage. He flinched at the words. I said that because I was drunk and angry and threatened by you. You represented everything I'd convinced myself didn't matter. No pedigree, no connections, no inherited wealth, just competence and hard work and intelligence. And somewhere in my twisted worldview, I'd decided those things were worth less than the circumstances of birth. They're worth more, I said. They're worth everything, because I earned what I have. You were born into what you had, and you still managed to lose it through arrogance and fraud. You're right, completely right, and I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or sympathy or help. I'm here because I owed you an apology face to face, acknowledging that I was wrong about you in every possible way. He stood to leave, then paused. Christopher loves you. He knows he failed you when it mattered. He's been in therapy, trying to understand why he couldn't stand up to me, why he prioritized keeping peace with his father over defending the woman he loved. He doesn't expect you to take him back. He just wants you to know that he understands what he lost. After Richard left, I sat in my apartment for a long time, thinking about revenge and consequences and the difference between the two. What I realized sitting there would determine not just how I moved forward with my life, but whether the destruction of Richard Whitmore's business empire was enough, or if there was something more important I needed to understand about justice and mercy. I hadn't sought revenge. I'd done my job. But I couldn't pretend there wasn't satisfaction in watching Richard face consequences for both his fraud and his cruelty. The question was, what now? He'd apologized. He was losing everything. Was that enough? I thought about the foster homes I'd lived in, the people who'd dismissed a traumatized kid as too damaged to be worth their effort. I thought about the teachers who'd assumed I wouldn't amount to anything because kids from my background rarely did. I thought about every time someone had looked at my resume and seen community college as a red flag rather than evidence of determination. And I thought about how I'd proven every single one of them wrong by refusing to let their judgment define my worth. Richard Whitmore was facing the same lesson, and it was destroying him. But maybe that destruction was necessary. Maybe people who built their identity on feeling superior to others needed to lose everything to understand that superiority was a fiction. 3 days after Richard's visit, Chris showed up at my office. The receptionist called, sounding uncertain. "Maya, Christopher Whitmore is here. Should I send him away?" "Give me 5 minutes, then send him to conference room C." I needed those 5 minutes to compose myself, to remember why I'd ended things, to shore up my defenses against the man I'd loved but couldn't trust to protect me when it mattered. Chris looked almost as bad as his father, thinner, exhausted, wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of his usual business casual. His hair was uncombed, and there was a desperate energy about him that made me sad. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, standing by the door, as if afraid to come further into the room. "You have 10 minutes. I know I don't deserve even that. I know I failed you in the worst possible way. I've been in therapy trying to understand why I couldn't defend you, why I let my father say those things without immediately shutting him down. Did you figure it out?" I was afraid of him, not physically, but emotionally. My whole life, I've been trying to earn his approval, to live up to his standards, to be the son he wanted. And when forced to choose between defending you and maintaining that relationship with him, I froze. I chose wrong, and I've lost you because of it. Yes, you have. I'm not here to ask you to take me back. I'm here to tell you that you were right about everything. My father was a bigot and a fraud. I was a coward, and you deserved so much better than both of us. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and set it on the conference table. "This is a letter I wrote. You don't have to read it now or ever. But I wanted you to have it. It explains everything I couldn't say that night, everything I should have said. It's not enough, but it's honest. Chris, I also want you to know that I've cut off contact with my father, not because of the business problems, though those are real, because of how he treated you and how he continues to refuse to genuinely acknowledge the harm he caused. My mother is divorcing him. Elaine and Michael are done with him too. He's facing all of this alone, and that's his choice and his consequence. Your mother came to see me. She told me you were struggling. I am, but that's not your problem. I just wanted you to know that losing you taught me something my father never could. That character matters more than pedigree, that standing up for what's right matters more than keeping peace, and that some mistakes cost you everything worth having." He turned to leave, then looked back. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Maya. I'm sorry I didn't fight for you when it mattered. I hope you find someone who will." After he left, I opened the letter. It was 12 pages, handwritten, and brutally honest. He detailed every moment of his cowardice, every choice he'd made to prioritize his father's approval over my dignity, every rationalization he'd told himself about why it was easier to ask me to endure Richard's treatment than to confront his father. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't suggest we could work things out. He simply acknowledged the truth and took responsibility for his failures. It was too late to save our relationship, but it was something. But the real test of whether I'd learned anything from this entire nightmare came 2 months later, when Richard Whitmore's company finally declared bankruptcy, and I had to decide whether to feel satisfaction or sympathy for the man who'd called me garbage. The bankruptcy made local news. Whitmore Industries, unable to secure funding for the environmental remediation and facing mounting regulatory penalties, filed for Chapter 11 reorganization. 143 employees faced uncertain futures. Richard himself was likely to lose his house, his savings, everything he'd spent 40 years building. My coworker showed me the article at lunch. "Isn't this your ex-boyfriend's father? The guy who was so awful to you?" "Yes." "Must feel good to see him get what he deserves." "Did it?" I examined my feelings honestly and found something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but sadness. Sadness for the employees losing their jobs because of Richard's fraud. Sadness for Patricia, who'd spent 35 years married to a man whose arrogance destroyed everything. Sadness even for Richard, who'd built his identity on superiority and was now learning that foundation was sand. But also a kind of peace, because I'd done nothing wrong. I'd simply been competent at my job, and if that competence revealed Richard's fraud, that was justice, not revenge. The difference mattered. I ran into Patricia one more time, 3 months after the bankruptcy filing. I was having coffee at a place in Back Bay when she approached my table, hesitant. "Maya, may I sit for a moment?" I gestured to the empty chair. She looked different, stronger somehow despite everything. She was dressed more simply than I'd ever seen her, and there was a lightness about her that hadn't been there before. "I wanted to update you," she said. "The divorce is final. I'm moving to Vermont, to a small house I inherited from my aunt, starting over at 62 years old." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm happier than I've been in years. Turns out living with someone who valued status over character was exhausting. I'm looking forward to a simpler life." "And Richard? Living in a condo, working as a consultant? He lost everything, but he's surviving, and maybe finally learning some humility. Christopher visits him occasionally, trying to rebuild some kind of relationship, but it's not the same." "I'm glad Chris is trying. Family is important, even when it's complicated." Patricia smiled. "You know what the irony is? Richard finally understands what you represented. Not street garbage, but everything he should have valued. Intelligence, hard work, integrity. He tells anyone who'll listen now about the brilliant paralegal who outworked his entire legal team. I think he's even proud, in a strange way, that Christopher dated someone that exceptional. Too little, too late." "Agreed, but it's something. He's changed, Maya. Not enough to undo the damage, but enough to maybe be a slightly better person going forward." After she left, I thought about that. Richard Whitmore had lost his business, his wife, his home, his reputation, and his relationship with his children. He'd faced consequences for his fraud and his cruelty. And maybe, somewhere in all that loss, he'd learned something. Was it enough? I didn't know. But I knew that I'd learned something too, that my worth was never dependent on Richard's assessment, that competence and integrity mattered more than pedigree and wealth, and that sometimes the best revenge was simply being excellent at your job and letting the consequences speak for themselves. 6 months after the dinner, I accepted a job offer from a different firm. Not because of the Whitmore situation, but because the new position was a significant step up. Senior paralegal supervisor, $100,000 salary, managing a team of 6 people. On my last day at Morrison & Holt, the senior partner took me aside. "You know why we're sorry to lose you, Maya? Because you represent everything we want in our professionals. Meticulous, ethical, brilliant, and humble enough to do the work without needing the credit. That's rare." "Thank you. Morrison & Holt taught me a lot." "We also learned from you." The Whitmore case became a teaching example for our summer associates. How thorough due diligence matters. How one detail can change everything. How professional integrity sometimes requires revealing uncomfortable truths. Your work on that case probably prevented a dozen future problems we'll never know about. I started my new job in January, leading a team, mentoring junior paralegals, building a career based on excellence rather than connections. And sometimes, when I trained new employees on the importance of reading every document carefully, I told them a story. Not about revenge, not about a wealthy CEO who underestimated me, but about how competence and integrity matter more than background, how one overlooked detail can change everything, and how the best way to prove your worth is simply to be exceptional at what you do. The street garbage paralegal who destroyed a CEO's empire became the senior supervisor who mentored the next generation of legal professionals. Richard Whitmore's insult became the catalyst for me understanding my own value in a way I'd never quite grasped before. Did I forgive him? Eventually, in the sense that I stopped carrying anger about it. But I never forgot, and I never regretted the consequences he faced, because those consequences weren't about revenge. They were about a man who committed fraud, facing the legal and professional ramifications of that choice, and a man who built his identity on superiority, learning that character mattered more than pedigree. A year after the dinner, I received a letter. Richard Whitmore, writing from his small condo, on plain paper instead of embossed stationery. 3 pages of genuine apology, acknowledgement of harm, and recognition that I'd done exactly what I should have done professionally. He didn't ask for anything. He just wanted me to know that he understood, finally, what I'd represented and what he'd lost by being too arrogant to see it. I wrote back, briefly, accepted the apology, wished him well in rebuilding his life, because holding on to anger would only hurt me, and I'd worked too hard to build a good life to let his mistakes continue to affect me. My boyfriend's father called me street garbage at a family dinner. Then I did my job with excellence and integrity, and the consequences of his fraud destroyed everything he'd built. I didn't plan revenge. I just refused to be less competent to protect his feelings. And in the end, that was more powerful than any revenge could have been. If Maya's story of professional excellence triumphing over wealth and pedigree resonated with you, hit that like button. My favorite moment was when Richard finally showed up to apologize and had to acknowledge that the street garbage paralegal was more competent than his entire legal team. What was yours? Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever been dismissed because of your background, remember that your worth is determined by your character and competence, not by someone else's prejudice. Subscribe for more stories about people who prove their worth through excellence rather than pedigree.